The laws of economics. It surrounds us, binds us. Rational beings are we, not this crude matter. Oh hi, I'm the Heretic. So in honor of Star Wars Day, I wanted to look at everybody's favorite fascists, the Galactic Empire. The Galactic Empire, or simply the Empire, was an autocracy that ruled over the majority of the known galaxy in the Star Wars universe. It was ruled over by Emperor Sheev Palpatine, otherwise known as Darth Sidious, a maniacal laughter enthusiast who took out his frustration over his raisin-faced state on the rest of the galaxy. Together with Darth Vader, they ruled the galaxy through fear, following the philosophy of chronic backstabbing syndrome called the Sith. They also get to shoot lightning from their hands, use telekinesis, and despite the fact that they use swords in a galaxy of laser guns and city-sized capital ships, they're still the deadliest sons of bitches in the galaxy. Now, as to why they wanted an empire in the first place, well, it's the culmination of 1,000 years of planning across many generations of Sith towards Sith dominion of the galaxy that would endure for all time. Darth Sidious envisioned himself ruling the Empire as its immortal emperor forever. To do so, he needed the resources that only an empire could provide him, so that he can finally pry the last secrets of the dark side from the Force. The secret to true immortality. Though he failed in his quest. Maybe failed. In the original trilogy, we witnessed the rise of Luke Skywalker, from nobody farm boy to savior of the galaxy, who redeems Darth Vader, who casts Sidious into his beloved Death Star, destroying him utterly. Though the dark side may rise, there is an ebb and flow to the Force, and the light will rise to meet it. Seriously, I hope they don't bring back Palpatine. I love the character, don't get me wrong, but making Return of the Jedi's ending meaningless and Vader's sacrifice pointless would be a mistake. But is Luke Skywalker, that boy, the only hope the galaxy has for throwing off the yoke of Sith tyranny?
No. There is another.
There is another hope. One that doesn't rely on the arbitrary whims of deterministic entities because it can't get its own dissociative personality disorder under control. There is another force beyond the Force, one far more powerful, heralding the rise and fall of nations, and would have brought the Empire, and even Palpatine himself, despite his OMG please nerf evil space wizard powers, to his knees. It's a force present even in our world, today. I speak of the laws of economics. Now, we don't know much about galactic economics in that galaxy far, far away. Firstly, because those details don't exist, and where they do, they're often hand-waved away into irrelevance for the sake of plot. It's not a result of malice, mind you. While you can say that a lot of Star Wars is political commentary,
either you are with us, or you are with the terrorists.
If you're not with me, then you're my enemy.
Sci-fi writers can't be expected to be knowledgeable on things like economics all the time, so I'm willing to give them the benefit of the doubt. My case will use a lot of conjecture and inferring, but one based on economic realities we can observe in our own world and apply to them. It might seem silly to apply a real-life science to a fictional setting, but in the absence of post-scarcity in the Star Wars universe, which is to say, infinite production, then they must have a mechanism for distributing scarce resources and ways optimally to do so, such as through supply and demand curves. These don't go away just because Wookiees and Star Destroyers exist. So we can use it to see why the Empire was doomed to fail. Let's start from the beginning. 1. The Republic Cartels. Many of the largest businesses that would form the core of the Confederacy of Independent Systems, that is to say, the eventual enemies of the Galactic Republic, such as the Trade Federation, the Techno Union, the Banking Clan, and others already exist and seem to have been formed from firms cartelizing. Actually, hold on. How did it come about that a place as wide and vast as a galaxy, where there should be a vast number of competing firms, should come to have most of these firms centralized into these conglomerates in any given industry? Why would a private company cartelize when they can have a competitive advantage by breaking from the cartel agreements or conglomeration? It's the same reason the railroads petitioned the federal government in the US to increase regulations on the railroad industry in the late 19th century, ostensibly to protect consumers, but in reality, to keep out competition and make it more difficult for railroads to violate cartel agreements. This is known as regulatory capture. When the government attempts to restrict certain economic activities, parties affected by these restrictions have an incentive to grab the levers of power for their own benefit. When you can use that power to restrict your competition, that gives you a de facto government-sponsored monopoly. While there's no clear evidence of this in the Star Wars universe, we can infer this due to the fact that the Trade Federation, the Banking Clan, the Techno Union, and others had seats on the Galactic Senate. I shouldn't need to explain how far corporatism needs to be for cartels to have their own representatives in government. That'd be like if Facebook, Google, and Boeing got to elect their own senators. I mean, it's not terribly far off from what they already do, but at least in the Galactic Senate, it's more obvious. But the point is, by using the Senate to grant themselves advantages in terms of contracts with the government, raising barriers to entry, and just generally keeping out competition, while at the same time using the state to maintain their cartels, the firms have less of an incentive to economize. This means over time, there is less production, less innovation, and higher costs for consumers, among these consumers being the state itself. The Galactic Republic, existing for thousands of years, may very well be the reason for the galaxy's technological stagnation. 2. Capital flight and militarization. Now, the beginning of the Separatist crisis happened because star systems seceded from the Galactic Republic en masse. The justification for this was the tariffs imposed by the Republic on formerly free trade routes. The economic effect of tariffs is to make goods and services more expensive. This meant that the Republic directly made life harder for the average person on these outlying star systems. We can see this in the real world, where the agricultural sector in the United States is bleeding due to Trump's tariffs. I personally know people who have lost jobs as a direct result of these tariffs. Because of this unnecessary hardship, many systems found it simply more profitable to disassociate from the Republic and form their own governments, while associating with other like-minded separatists. These were supported by the cartels previously mentioned, who supplied goods and capital to the burgeoning Confederacy, as well as the weapons and armor that would be useful in the coming Clone Wars. With the exchange occurring outside of Republic jurisdiction and outside of their ability to tax, the result is lost productivity for the Republic, as well as collapsing tax revenue. The ability for the Republic to fund its own bureaucracy and welfare state would have already become much more difficult, and we haven't even begun the Clone Wars yet. Due to shenanigans, the details of which aren't terribly important, the Republic began to militarize, building massive capital ships, providing funding for the creation of and equipping an army of clones. Though the Sith were able to finance this largely out of their own pockets, the idea that they can equip an entire galaxy-conquering army, not only with guns and armor, but capital ships as well, even with the active participation of the Banking Clan cartel, is absolutely ludicrous. It's the equivalent of getting George Soros and Goldman Sachs to build a new fleet of aircraft carriers, along with equipping, training, and paying 1 million new US soldiers with weapons, tanks, drones, light vehicles, helicopters, planes, bombers, and God knows what else. They can't do it. The state needs to pay for it somehow. More likely than not, they take out one or more loans from the Banking Clan, as well as try to print money through a central bank to pay for it. While there's no clear evidence the Republic had a central bank, Government spending must expand exponentially in contrast to the linear growth of tax revenue. This is the case with all governments, as bureaucracies must expand to administer government projects. You can see this with the United States today, with its population of 315 million. All actual figures of the galactic population is hard to find, and perhaps will be extremely inaccurate, because sci-fi writers have no sense of scale. It's safe to say the Galactic Republic, with territory covering most of the known galaxy, had a population much, much, much higher than 315 million. They can't pay for that with taxes or borrowing, at least not indefinitely. They need to print money, so they need a central bank. It's inevitable that all states debase and devalue their own currency. The war hasn't even started yet, and already the Republic's finances are off to a rocky start. I mean, they had to be. Otherwise, the taxation of formerly free trade routes wouldn't be seen as necessary in the first place. All that really happened is that by driving many taxpayers out of the Republic, they made their financial troubles even worse. 3. The Clone Wars. Much like in the American Civil War, the Galactic Republic, or more specifically the Jedi Order, who at this point were pretty much Republic military, aggressed against the otherwise peaceful Confederacy of Independent Systems, all to restrict a foreign power's right to disassociate. The Clone Wars was a conflict between the clone armies of the Galactic Republic and the droid armies of the Confederacy of Independent Systems. Now, war is expensive. Like, really, really expensive. Not just expensive in terms of weaponry, training, and personnel, but expensive in terms of collateral damage and opportunity costs. All the industry that could be used for providing value are instead geared towards reducing it elsewhere under the directive of one or two coercive monopolies. As a result of the massive destruction of capital and the repurposing of capital towards destruction rather than production, productivity declines. Taxable commerce plummets. Tax revenue plummets. This leaves the Republic and the CIS with 4 options. Increase taxes even further, print money, borrow money, or cut services. Since this is the government we're talking about, we know they won't cut services. But as for borrowing, the main lending institution, the banking clan, is happy to help both sides. But it's clear that even they are losing their patience as they lend to the Republic with high interest rates. High interest rates means the Republic's credit rating is very low, and the banking clan has little confidence in the Republic being able to pay it back. Make no mistake, the Republic is at its breaking point right now. The debt still has to be paid back sometime. Being the Republic, in order to pay for the interest on their debt to the banking clan, needs to lean more heavily on commerce. Commerce that is already bleeding because of the war. This means more taxation, more economic restriction, and doing more of the stuff that caused the separatist crisis to happen in the first place, making life more expensive for the average galactic citizen. At the tail end of the Clone Wars, by the time Palpatine was making his move and beginning the Galactic Empire with himself as Emperor, well, we have to ask, what's left? 4. The Empire of Nothing. So the Empire came about not by conquest, but through the political process. Palpatine scared all the politicians into transforming a mercantilist democracy into a mercantilist autocracy. But as far as the balance books are concerned, nothing has changed. There's no reason to think their debt to the banking clan should have gone away. Even though the Empire nationalized the banking clans, the debt is still on the balance books. The money printing needed to fund the Clone Wars didn't suddenly not result in inflation either. Though the transition to the Empire heralded dark times for the galaxy, the economics of the galaxy were already headed in that direction. The destruction of the separatist leadership and the absorption of CIS corporate assets and worlds into the new empire wouldn't have changed anything. Guess what? The CIS was bleeding financially too. The banking clan was at the brink of collapse by the end of the Clone Wars, so there's no money left. The last nickels in the piggy bank got blown up in some mid-rim planet with a name nobody can pronounce. No vendor will want to do business with the Empire since they probably won't ever get paid, and no government can efficiently produce goods or services since there's no incentive for them to do so. If they try to produce what they need themselves, it will always result in a loss, because the government, when it produces, has no supply and demand curves. Simply changing your name and leadership structure doesn't wipe clean your balance books. Plus, without a huge financier to bootstrap the regime change, such as with the Rothschilds financing the American Revolution and the Nazi regime, among others, in the real world, well, you ain't got money. Palpatine has engineered the rise of an empire, but all he got was an empire of debt. Clearly, the sensible thing for Palpatine to do would be to consolidate the Empire's assets, especially those acquired from the cartels, and sell them off. Also, sell off some of the wartime assets, such as capital ships and military holdings, since after all you're no longer at war, and use the proceeds to pay down the debt, liberate the economy to bolster it, and maximize taxable productivity. But no, instead what he wants to do is double down on military spending. 5. The Death Star. If you remember, the Republic built up its military massively prior to the Clone Wars. Now the Empire repeats that same mistake. However, unlike the Republic and the CIS, the Empire has no clear enemy to justify their massive military buildup. Take the humble Imperial-class Star Destroyer, which is anything but humble, approximately 1 mile long and armed to the teeth. In its day, the Star Destroyer was a force to be reckoned with, and a pricey one at that. Building the components of an Imperial Star Destroyer would cost approximately $656 billion in the real world, with probably a lot more when you take into account technology we can't even conceive of yet. Namely turbo lasers, shield generators, artificial gravity, hyperdrives, power generators for it all, etc. Getting all the pieces that we can get and we can manufacture into space would cost another $44.4 trillion. Even if construction took place purely in space, materials would still need to be moved from planets into space for it to be assembled, so it's an expensive venture by any standard of measurement. At its height, the Galactic Empire had roughly 25,000 of these pizza-shaped splotches of red ink on Imperial balance sheets. That's not even counting frigates, support ships, and TIE fighters. The Tarkin Doctrine was a military and political philosophy named after this magnificent bastard. It emphasized the use of unnecessarily large and unbelievably expensive ships, disfavoring cheaper and more versatile starfighters to create a military force beyond reproach, so that the Empire can rule its subjects through fear, and fear alone. Because obviously giant unwieldy ships will stop everyone from trading around the Empire, right? But let's address the elephant in the room, or rather, the moon in the room.
That's no moon. It's a space station.
You know it, one of the most iconic spacecraft in fiction. According to an analysis by students at Leahy University, the Death Star would cost $852 quadrillion to construct, and that's just the cost of the steel alone. Not counting things like electronics, wiring, life support systems, getting all of those things into space, or all the other sci-fi components like artificial gravity, energy shielding, additional plating, or even this thing. Which, let's talk about the Death Star's super laser. The amount of energy needed to convert an Earth-sized planet into energy, which is presumably what is happening here, would need to be, well, obscene. When I converted the mass of the Earth into energy, I got this number. When I looked up how much energy in joules the sun produces in 1 year, I got this. Divide that, and we see that converting the Earth, which is presumably the same mass as Alderaan, into energy would require more energy than the sun produces in 4,384,171 years. Now granted, Alderaan wasn't completely turned to energy since an asteroid field did remain, but these figures should help you appreciate the vast energy requirements the Death Star has. Even if the Death Star were a Nikolai Dyson beam, a theoretical megastructure that weaponizes a star, forcing the entirety of its energy output into a single beam of energy, it still couldn't accomplish destruction on the scale of the Death Star. Now, in the Star Wars universe, the Republic was actually working on the battle station long before the Empire came about, but the question still remains. How was it paid for? Given that states cannot produce value without first reducing value, its only funding mechanisms are through borrowing, printing, and taxation. To pay for it, they need a financier, greater debt than perhaps even during the height of the Clone Wars. Their creditors' only hope of being paid back was the awe and terror that Death Star inspired, making rebellion against the Empire unthinkable. Thus, they would have no choice but to keep their head down and pay their taxes. Then, only then, is it possible that whatever wild and completely insane financier the Empire got a hold of to pay for this project could possibly be paid back. And just like that, the possibility of a safe and financially secure society is gone. The possibility of the Empire's creditors getting their money back just dropped to zero. And they're almost certainly knocking on the Emperor's door, calling in their loans. The destruction of the first Death Star should have driven the galaxy into utter financial ruin. The Empire, with no way to pay off their debts, means their creditors, whether they be a central bank or some other financial entity, would be forced to write off the debt, which would almost certainly signal the end for that institution, as their value as a company is utterly decimated. To illustrate how, imagine if you had your savings stored at a bank. Suddenly, in 1 hour, the bank loses 90% of its assets. I know I'd be tempted to pull my savings out of that bank as quickly as possible. By the way, I mentioned the energy output of the Death Star. Well, the average kilowatt hour in the US costs about 9.6 cents. Convert kilowatt hours into joules and divide the energy potential of the mass of Alderaan being converted completely into energy by that amount in joules and multiply it by the cost per joule. From that, I can get an estimate of how much it costs the Empire to fire the super laser. Forget about the destruction of the Death Star. Simply firing it costs this much. Even if we're being generous, and we cut it down to 10% of that amount, after all, the Death Star doesn't completely turn Alderaan into energy, the kind of finances needed to build this weapon, let alone fire it, are beyond obscene. The idea that the banking clan didn't just laugh Sidious out of the room when he came to them with the proposal for this superweapon is insane to me. Considering the sheer scale this institution would have to be to make a loan like this to the Republic, who were building the Death Star first, we're looking at a galactic bank run. It's absolutely ludicrous that the economy would remain stable at all after the Empire just shot $1 decillion worth of super laser at Alderaan. So how the hell did the Empire manage to finance the building of a second Death Star? The only explanation is that the economy of the galaxy is so strong that while the costs of the Death Star are a strain, it is affordable, and the Empire must have taxed the hell out of it. But there's one problem. 6. What economy? Republic restrictions on business encourage economic cronyism, such that the only actors in a given industry were firms the Republic supported. This had the effect of eliminating competition, reducing firms' incentive to compete, to streamline and innovate their modes of production, resulting in economic stagnation. The Empire took this and turned the restrictions up to 11. Entire industries were nationalized, their assets seized by the state, and what was left was under such heavy restriction, it was private industry in name only. In this mercantilist economic model, firms are completely insulated from competition, exacerbating the economic troubles of the Republic. Monopolies breed inefficiency, which raises the cost of living, eventually driving down production. After the devastation of the Clone Wars, much of the productive capacity of the galaxy would have been decimated. Much of it would have had to have been rebuilt. Although many, especially those of the Keynesian school of economics, would argue that this need for rebuilding would be a huge economic boom, it's just the broken window fallacy on a galactic scale. Economic demand is want plus the ability to pay for it. Simply wanting your planet rebuilt doesn't mean you can afford to, and because the Republic taxed and spent their way through the Clone Wars, you won't be able to afford to rebuild your planet. This is the state of the galaxy that Emperor Palpatine inherited. It was already hanging by a thread as it is, but the moment this happened, and especially this, this should have become this. The loss of so much in economic assets to fuel one man's ambition for immortality should have been the death knell for the galactic economy. Perhaps this was Palpatine's plan all along. Emperor Raisinbrand had contingency plans to destroy the Empire should it survive past his own life, and perhaps the collapse of the economy was part of that plan, to create a galaxy so economically devastated that the Rebel Alliance could never hope to rebuild it for decades to come as a final screw you to everyone. In a way, the Death Star was not only a weapon of mass destruction in the planetary sense, but in the economic sense. Not only an invincible battle station that couldn't be beaten by any means militarily, but even if they did, it would spell certain economic ruin. The true power of the Death Star is mutually assured economic destruction. This is the means by which Emperor Palpatine wanted to remain in power for the foreseeable future. But even so, the Empire was fracturing under the pressure of its strained finances, built on a foundation of economic destitution and wartime debt. The Emperor might have been able to zap his way into maintaining his political power forever, but in only a few short decades, there will be nothing left to rule over but steel and ash. The desperate citizens of the galaxy killing each other over what's left. It should be telling that the only industry that was booming during the time of the Empire was black market smuggling. Questions, comments, critique? How long do you think the Galactic Empire would have lasted? How is it that in the new movies, the First Order seems to have unlimited resources besides some kind of techno-magic bullcrap? Did I ruin the movies for you forever? Leave a comment below. Support me on Patreon. Like, share, and subscribe to become a heretic today. Oh, and by the way, the Confederacy of Independent Systems did nothing wrong.